The year was 1922, and the dusty streets of Los Angeles were about to witness something extraordinary. A woman in her 30s, dressed modestly but radiating an otherworldly confidence, stepped onto a makeshift platform erected in the heart of the city. Her name was Amy Semple McPherson, and she was about to heal a man who hadn't walked in 15 years. As thousands watched in stunned silence, she placed her hands on the paralyzed stranger and commanded him to rise. What happened next would spark a religious revolution that would sweep across America like wildfire, leaving behind a trail of faith, controversy, and transformation that would define an entire era. Welcome to the lost world of tent revivals and traveling preachers, a universe where the impossible seemed routine, where ordinary farmers became overnight evangelists, and where the line between divine intervention and human spectacle blurred beyond recognition. This is a story of America's spiritual Wild West, where charismatic leaders built empires under canvas cathedrals, and millions of desperate souls found hope, healing, and sometimes heartbreak. For nearly a century, from the 1880s through the 1980s, these nomadic crusades crisscrossed the American landscape, transforming vacant lots into temporary temples and turning unknown preachers into household names. They promised miracles, delivered drama, and created a uniquely American form of religious theater that would influence everything from rock concerts to political rallies. But behind the spectacle lay deeper truths about a nation in constant motion, searching for meaning in an increasingly complex world. The tent revival wasn't just entertainment, it was a lifeline for the forgotten, the marginalized, and the desperate. It was democracy in its purest form, where anyone with conviction and charisma could claim divine authority and build a following. The roots of this phenomenon stretch back to the late 1800s, when America was undergoing massive transformation. The Civil War had ended, industrialization was changing the very fabric of society, and millions of people were moving from rural communities to bustling cities. Traditional churches, with their formal services and established hierarchies, seemed increasingly out of touch with the needs of ordinary Americans struggling to make sense of their rapidly changing world. Into this vacuum stepped a new breed of religious entrepreneur. These weren't seminary-trained theologians or established clergy. They were farmers, laborers, and small-town dreamers who claimed to have received direct revelations from God. They preached a different kind of Christianity, one that promised immediate results, personal transformation, and direct access to the divine. The first true superstar of this movement was a man named Sam Jones, a former alcoholic lawyer from Georgia who found religion and traded his courtroom for a canvas cathedral. Jones pioneered what would become the standard tent revival format: emotional preaching, audience participation, and an emphasis on personal testimony. But Jones was just the beginning. Soon, dozens of traveling evangelists were following his model, each adding their own unique twist to the formula. What made these revivals so powerful wasn't just the preaching. It was the entire experience. Imagine arriving at a dusty field on the outskirts of town as the sun begins to set. A massive canvas tent, capable of holding thousands of people, dominates the landscape. The smell of sawdust and sweat mingles with the aroma of fried chicken and cotton candy from vendors who've set up around the perimeter. Inside the tent, wooden benches stretch as far as the eye can see, all facing a simple platform where a lone microphone stands waiting. The atmosphere is electric with anticipation. Families arrive by wagon, automobile, and on foot, many having traveled hundreds of miles to attend. There's a democracy here unlike anywhere else in American society. Wealthy merchants sit next to sharecroppers, white families next to black families, all united by a common hunger for something beyond their everyday struggles. As the service begins, the tent fills with music unlike anything heard in traditional churches. These aren't formal hymns accompanied by organ music. These are foot-stomping, hand-clapping songs led by guitar-playing evangelists who understand that music is the fastest way to a human heart. The crowd sings along, their voices rising and falling in perfect harmony, creating a sound that seems to make the very canvas walls vibrate with spiritual energy. Then comes the preacher. These men, and increasingly women, were natural-born performers who understood that salvation was as much about entertainment as enlightenment. They paced the platform like caged tigers, their voices rising from whispers to shouts, their gestures sweeping and dramatic. They told stories that made the Bible come alive, painting vivid pictures of ancient miracles while promising that the same power was available to anyone willing to believe. But the real magic happened during the altar call. As the preacher's voice reached its crescendo, he would invite anyone seeking healing, salvation, or simply a touch from the divine to come forward. What followed was often indescribable. Hundreds of people streaming toward the platform, many weeping, some shouting, others falling to their knees in apparent spiritual ecstasy. Wheelchairs were abandoned, crutches discarded, and testimonies of miraculous healing filled the air. Were these miracles real? That question would fuel decades of controversy and investigation. Skeptics pointed to the power of suggestion, the emotional manipulation inherent in the revival format, and the documented cases of fraud that occasionally surfaced. But believers countered with their own evidence: medical records showing unexplained recoveries, lives dramatically transformed, and personal testimonies of supernatural encounters that defied rational explanation. One of the most fascinating aspects of the tent revival phenomenon was how it created its own economy. A successful evangelist could earn more in a week than most Americans made in a year. They traveled in luxury, lived in mansions, and built vast media empires around their ministries. Yet this prosperity gospel sat uncomfortably with the humble origins of Christianity, creating a tension that would eventually contribute to the movement's decline. Consider the case of A. Allen, a poor farm boy from Arkansas who became one of the most controversial figures in revival history. Allen claimed to perform miracles so dramatic that even other evangelists questioned their authenticity. He once allegedly raised a woman from the dead during a service in California, an event that was never independently verified but became part of revival folklore. Allen's meetings were known for their intensity. People would fall unconscious, speak in unknown languages, and claim to receive visions of heaven and hell. But Allen's story also illustrates the darker side of the revival world. Despite his massive following and considerable income, he struggled with alcoholism and was eventually expelled from the Assemblies of God denomination for misconduct. His fall from grace was spectacular and public, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority. The tent revival circuit was a predominantly American phenomenon, but its influence extended far beyond national borders. European observers were fascinated by what they saw as a uniquely American form of religious expression, democratic, emotional, and entrepreneurial in a way that traditional European Christianity could never be. These revivals embodied the American dream in religious form. The idea that anyone, regardless of background or education, could achieve greatness through faith and determination. Women played a particularly important role in this movement, often in ways that would have been impossible in traditional church structures. Amy Semple McPherson, whom we met at the beginning of our story, was perhaps the most famous example. She founded the Foursquare Gospel Church, pioneered religious broadcasting, and built the massive Angelus Temple in Los Angeles. Her theatrical preaching style and controversial personal life made her a constant fixture in newspaper headlines, but her influence on American Christianity was undeniable. McPherson understood better than almost anyone that the revival was as much about spectacle as spirituality. Her services featured elaborate sets, costume changes, and dramatic reenactments of biblical stories. She once arrived at a service riding a motorcycle to illustrate her sermon about being a messenger for God. Critics accused her of trivializing religion, but her supporters argued that she was simply making the gospel accessible to ordinary people in language they could understand. Quick question for our viewers: where are you watching from tonight, and what's your profession? The tent revivals drew people from every walk of life, from doctors to ditch diggers, and I'd love to know what brings you to stories about America's spiritual past. Drop a comment and let me know. Are you a history buff, a student of religion, or just someone curious about the strange and fascinating corners of American culture? The golden age of tent revivals reached its peak in the decades following World War II. A generation of Americans, traumatized by war and facing an uncertain future in the atomic age, found comfort in the old-time religion promised by traveling evangelists. This was also the era of Oral Roberts, perhaps the most successful and influential revivalist of all time. Roberts transformed the tent revival from a regional curiosity into a national phenomenon. His massive tent, capable of seating 2,500 people, was a marvel of engineering that required a crew of 70 men to erect. Roberts pioneered the use of television to broadcast his services, bringing the tent revival experience into millions of American homes. His catchphrase, "Something good is going to happen to you," became a cultural touchstone, and his emphasis on prosperity theology would influence American Christianity for generations to come. But Roberts also understood that the tent revival was ultimately about personal connection. Despite the massive scale of his operations, he made each person in the audience feel as though he was speaking directly to them. He would lay hands on the sick, pray with the troubled, and offer hope to anyone willing to believe. His followers credited him with everything from healing cancer to raising the dead, claims that brought both fame and scrutiny. The investigative journalists who followed Roberts and other major evangelists uncovered a complex world of carefully orchestrated theater. They found that many of the most dramatic healings were staged, using planted audience members who pretended to be cured of various ailments. They discovered elaborate systems for gathering information about attendees before services, allowing preachers to appear to have supernatural knowledge about people they'd never met. Yet, even the skeptics had to admit that something genuine was happening at these revivals. The staged healings might have been fake, but the transformed lives were real. People who had struggled with addiction found sobriety, broken families were reconciled, and communities that had been divided by race and class found common ground under the big tent. This tension between authenticity and artifice was perhaps the defining characteristic of the tent revival phenomenon. The critics weren't wrong. There was a lot of showmanship, manipulation, and outright fraud in the revival circuit. But the believers weren't wrong either. Countless people found genuine spiritual experiences and life-changing encounters that couldn't be easily explained or dismissed. The decline of the tent revival began in the 1970s and accelerated through the following decades. Several factors contributed to this decline. Television had made it possible for people to experience religious services from the comfort of their homes, reducing the need for traveling evangelists. The rise of megachurches provided many of the same benefits as tent revivals: dynamic preaching, emotional worship, and a sense of community, without the uncertainties of traveling ministries. Moreover, a series of high-profile scandals involving prominent evangelists had damaged the reputation of the entire movement. When television evangelist Jim Bakker was convicted of fraud in the 1980s and his PTL ministry collapsed, it marked a turning point in American attitudes toward charismatic religious leaders. The public became more skeptical of claims of divine healing and miraculous intervention, and the mainstream media began treating revival meetings more as curiosities than as serious religious events. But perhaps the most significant factor in the decline of tent revivals was the changing nature of American society itself. The rural, agricultural America that had provided the primary audience for traveling evangelists was disappearing, replaced by an increasingly urban and educated population that was less receptive to old-fashioned revivalism. The social media age brought new forms of religious expression that didn't require physical gathering under a canvas roof. Today, the classic tent revival is largely a thing of the past, surviving mainly in small rural communities and as a nostalgic throwback to an earlier era. Yet its influence on American culture continues to reverberate in ways both obvious and subtle. The prosperity gospel preached by many contemporary megachurch pastors traces its origins directly back to tent revival theology. The theatrical, performance-oriented style of modern Christian rock concerts owes much to the staging techniques pioneered by traveling evangelists. Even political rallies, with their emphasis on emotional connection and mass conversion experiences, bear unmistakable similarities to the tent revival format. The tent revival phenomenon also left behind a rich legacy of music, literature, and folklore that continues to influence American culture. The songs that were popularized at revival meetings became the foundation for modern gospel and country music. Writers like Sinclair Lewis and Flannery O'Connor drew inspiration from the revival world for their explorations of American spirituality and social hypocrisy. And the stories, both true and embellished, that emerged from decades of tent meetings have become part of American mythology. Perhaps most importantly, the tent revival represented something uniquely American. The belief that ordinary people could have extraordinary encounters with the divine, that social hierarchies meant nothing in the face of spiritual truth, and that transformation was always possible for anyone willing to believe. These ideas, whether you accept their religious underpinnings or not, reflect core American values of democracy, individualism, and optimism that continue to shape our national character. The preachers who built this movement understood something profound about human nature, that people hunger not just for entertainment or even inspiration, but for genuine transcendence. They may have been showmen, but they were showmen with a message that resonated deeply with their audiences. They promised that life could be better, that suffering had meaning, and that hope was always possible. In our current age of digital connectivity and virtual experiences, there's something almost quaint about the idea of thousands of people gathering in a tent to hear a single person speak about God. Yet the human needs that drew people to these revivals, the desire for community, meaning, and spiritual connection, haven't disappeared. They've simply found new outlets and new expressions. The story of tent revivals and traveling preachers is ultimately a story about the eternal human search for something greater than ourselves. Whether you view these events as genuine encounters with the divine or as elaborate exercises in mass psychology, there's no denying their profound impact on American culture and spirituality. They represented a unique moment in our history when the sacred and the theatrical merged in ways that were both inspiring and troubling, authentic and artificial, transformative and tragic. Hey there, Professor Archive community. If you've made it this far into our journey through the tent revival phenomenon, I want to say thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of America's most fascinating religious movements. These stories of faith, fraud, and transformation reveal so much about who we are as a people and what we're willing to believe. If this deep dive into America's spiritual Wild West has educated, entertained, or enlightened you in any way, consider showing your appreciation with a super thanks. It really helps support the channel and allows us to keep bringing you these forgotten chapters of history. Your support means everything to a small history channel trying to preserve these important stories. As we've seen tonight, the world of tent revivals was never black and white. It was a realm where genuine faith coexisted with calculated showmanship, where miraculous healings shared space with documented fraud, and where the highest spiritual aspirations mingled with the most human of failings. Perhaps that's what made it so quintessentially American. It was messy, contradictory, and impossible to categorize, but undeniably powerful and transformative for millions of people. The next time you see a modern megachurch service, attend a political rally, or even go to a rock concert, remember the tent revivals. Their DNA lives on in all these forms of mass gathering and collective experience. The preachers who once stood on simple wooden platforms under canvas roofs understood something timeless about the human condition, that we are all searching for something to believe in, something to hope for, and something that makes our brief time on this earth meaningful. The tent may have been folded up and the preachers may have moved on, but the questions they raised about faith, community, and the American dream continue to resonate today. In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, perhaps there's something we can learn from an era when thousands of strangers could gather under a single roof, united by shared hopes and common humanity. Until next time, this is Professor Archive, reminding you that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about understanding the complex, contradictory, and endlessly fascinating story of who we are and how we got here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.